Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize that I'm speaking in English. Okay. Can you imagine a shaman ritual without music? In Korea, the shaman sings in recitative. She, unlike in Siberia, the vast majority of Korean shamans have always been women, sings melodiously to entertain the spirits she has invoked. She prays. She invokes the dead through song. She dances to percussion music. She constantly interacts with her instrumental accompanists. When she dances, her accompanists never stop playing. When she pauses, the musicians take over, improvising around rhythmic models and folk song melodies. In this paper, I'm concerned primarily with music. So right at the beginning, let me note that ritual accompanists often work in secular contexts as much as in sacred rituals. And the music they use in different rituals, in different contexts, can be related. So there's an overlap between the sacred and secular, which I suspect, because we're too overly concerned with concepts of the sacred, is often ignored. Now, in this presentation, I'm first going to paint a broad picture of music in Korean rituals, and then explore the use of shamanism in today's Korea, particularly in Seoul. So music is essential to ritual throughout the world. It acts as a stimulant. It can help block out the physical surroundings. It aids a ritualist to concentrate or allows him or her to lose concentration. It can be used to regularize body activity or to destabilize mental and physical behavior. None of this is unique to Korea, for on a global stage, music is a vital part of religious and quasi-religious rites. In the contemporary West, incessant drum beating is used in neo-shamanic soul retrieval by Michael Harner. An alternative vision of wholeness to that, with percussive elements backgrounded, is offered by purveyors of ambient music such as Berlin's Tangerine Dream, England's Brian Eno, Philip Glass, Claire Hamill. A parallel could also be drawn with Christianity, with, say, the Taizé choruses or the Australian Hillsong. Together, but offering different notions of the effective qualities of music, these percussive and timeless sounds invoke concepts in some way based on shamanic tradition, and a tradition that's shared with 1960s Timothy Leary-esque psychedelia, concepts such as finding the soul, making whole, journeying. Music, we can conclude, is the most plastic of arts, and so it's the most open to interpretation. The French scholar Gilbert Rouget once argued that possession trance seems to require everywhere and at all times a form of music belonging to the most everyday and popular system. And this might seem reasonable in parts of Africa, and he was talking about Africa, for example, amongst the Shona of Zimbabwe. But in Asian scholarship, there's always a common perception that shaman music is and should be distinct from other musics. For the Korean case, this has been discussed by many scholars, including Badavine Valravan, who I don't have down there, so never mind. And Korean musicians themselves use vocal style as a distinguishing point. Some acknowledge a similarity between singing and secular, ritual singing and secular pansori, the sort of epic storytelling through song, particularly where the two genres coexist in the southwestern Chola provinces of Korea. Although the shamans are often denigrated by pansori specialists for using a yellow voice, something slightly pornographic, but with too much vibrato. The claim is always that sacred and secular were once different, but decline has led to an overlap. And decline also provides an excuse for using small ensembles of accompanists in rituals, and allows secular musicians to stand in for reputed specialists who've died. And this is going to be particularly important as we consider rituals in Seoul today. Throughout the world, we encounter divisions between sacred and secular, which are based on history. Consider in the European Baroque the distinction between Mass and motet, or the normative claim that the call to prayer in Islamic cultures is not music at all. The idea that the sacred is more ancient actually echoes an anthropologist, David Ritchie's theory that shamanism marks a certain point in the evolution of all religions. The argument is that Balinese Ketchak or the whirling dervishes in Turkey are contemporary manifestations of something much older, and in the older, something shamanic. In Korea too, shaman roots are sought for much of the traditional music canon, notably in a standard and much published account by the late musicologist Han Man-yong. And this feeds into the student-led culture of the masses of the 1970s and 1980s, when shaman rituals were used to cleanse university campuses of the smells from the Korean military government. The late 1970s is essentially when some enterprising promoters began to put shaman ritualists out of their old context onto Seoul's stages. And it's often said that the first such staged ritual was actually at the Seoul Theatre, a place owned by the Anglican Church in Seoul. Anyway, Han Man-yong, who promoted this idea, was a Christian, and he wasn't sure he wanted to see shamanism preserved. He simply took from common perceptions abroad about music and ritual in the past and transferred them into Korea. And when he first presented his argument, one of the scholars who was there to respond to it said, "You actually haven't got any historical evidence. There is no real evidence that shamanism was there in the past and was using music." That's not strictly true. If we look at this picture, this is a vessel which was excavated in the southeast in Gyeongju. It dates from somewhere towards the end of the 3rd century. And right in the middle, you can see a very pregnant woman playing a zither. It appears as if there's a snake going through the zither. And Han Man-yong and other Korean scholars interpret this as a sign that ancient rituals were shamanic, they were for the giving of life, and they used music. Before I go any further, I probably need to tell you a definition of shamanism. Here's my definition from the Blackwell Dictionary of Religions, which came out in 1995. So shaman is the name given by the Tungus of Siberia to ritual practitioners who are considered to act as intermediaries with the spirit world. In an ecstatic state, the shaman may journey to the realm of the spirits, seeking help as a healer or seer and conducting the soul of a newly deceased. The journey is typically experienced as a flight or as possession, or spirits enter and possess the shaman, giving them power. The shaman binds society together by the ritual enshrining of an account of historical origins. Shamanism labels the practices of such practitioners and is used by extension from Siberia for similar activities amongst Arctic and Uraltaic groups. As a result of diffusion and cultural survival, shamans are found amongst the Lapps, Inuit, American Indians, the Ainu of Japan, the Koreans, in many parts of Southeast Asia such as Vietnam, Thailand and Indonesia, and elsewhere. And at this point I should show you just a clip of a Korean shaman ritual.
배에서부터 퍼져나왔다고 하니까요. 아마 짐작만으로도 그 분위기가 상상이 되실 겁니다. 이렇게 축제의 분위기로 이어져 온 이 황해도 배연신꽃과 대동꽃은 특히 김금화 명인에 의해서 그 원형이 오늘날까지 전해지고 있는데요. 고향을 잃으신 실향민들에게는 고향의 느낌까지
This is not the ritual, of course.
특별한 선물이 될 것 같습니다. 함께 보시죠.
This is a shaman from the northwest of Korea. Her name is Kim Kumoi, born in 1931. She's now, 84, 85. In a traditional ritual, she'd use the knife and other knives that she's got around her to show her power over the spirits. She would use the knife against herself and she wouldn't bleed. She would then stand on knives. Here she's just going to stand on a bowl. And now jumping ahead, just one other ritual which I'm going to be talking quite a bit about, if I can get it. So now from the southwest of Korea, this is Chindo Shikinkut. The cloth here is a cloth of life. So to send the soul of the dead to the other world, you basically have to move them along this cloth. And at the end, split the cloth into two so that the path is destroyed, so they can't get back to this earth. She's using paper streamers. Paper streamers attract the spirits. They instruct them to dance. They're based on 18th century money, paper money. And in the streamers, there is a paper spirit representing the soul of the dead. Those of you who are Buddhists might pick up Nami Amu Tabul going on here. The soul, the clothes of the dead. Now, a ritual like that in the local countryside, let me come back into there, will go on all night, about 8 hours, and I don't have 8 hours to talk to you for, so I must just use excerpts. And clearly there you're looking at something that's staged. It's not in a local village, which is what I'm really talking about today. The sort of sacred secular overlap can neatly be seen in one Korean rhythmic cycle called kutgori. The term kutgori means ritual plus scene. That's fair enough. But actually, when this cycle appears in shaman rituals, it tends to be called something different. And the term kutgori is reserved for a secular rhythm, the characteristic rhythm of Korean dance. It sort of goes kidong kok tororo kung kidok tororo kong kidok, and B taung dong tak dong do kung tok kung do, or something like this. And now I'm going to play you from a ritual, if I can find it on this excerpt, this rhythm with instruments. And here we go. If anybody's seen Koreans dancing, they will often dance like this. Two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Actually, I've traced that rhythm back at least to the 13th century, which is not bad going considering that we don't have any music recordings going back before the invention of the phonograph in 1870, whenever it was. There's a very long history for that particular rhythm. Moving forwards, though, from ancient history, The intimate and essential relationship between shamans and ritual musicians is seen in an 18th century painting by Shin Yun Bok, which you've got here, born 1758, where the shaman is supported by two musicians. But what is the relationship? Well, memories of those I've talked with are that in Korea's central and northern provinces, secular musicians were until the last 2 decades routinely hired by shamans to play the fiddle, the haegum, the piri, the oboe, and other melodic instruments. Male or female helpers, almost regardless of skill, regularly played percussion instruments, particularly the double-headed hourglass drum, the chango, cymbals, and large gong. In the southern provinces of Cholla and Gyeongsang, a shaman's husband often led her accompanying instrumental ensemble. He was sometimes called a hwarang, a term in the distant past used for celebrated musicians and dancers. The Japanese folklorist Moriyama in 1932 reported that ritual musicians were called hwarang in the southeast and southwest. Today, though, hwarang is a colloquial speech reserved for a lazy good-for-nothing. And given that Korea remains a patrilineal, male-dominated society, use of the term typically reflects the fact that wives, as shamans, make money while the husbands use that money. Here's one husband and wife team with 2 other people. At the front, the shaman is Lee Wan-sun, and to her right behind her is Kim Ki-bong. They were from Chindo and performed Shikimkut. Kim, or rather Yi, the shaman at the front, she'd been married before, but her husband was abusive and would do nothing, so she left him. She came back to Chindo, where she married Kim Ki-bong. Kim Ki-bong also had another wife, so this was his second wife. He lived with his first wife on the west of the island, and she, the shaman, lived on the east of the island, and so they could get double the number of rituals between them. Here they're performing just before the main ritual, asking for the spirits of the house to allow them to perform, with 2 very celebrated musicians at the back. On the left, Kang Han-soo, I'll come back to him in a minute, and then in the center, Park Byung-chon. Again, I'll come back to him. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about him now. Park Byung-chon, who lived from 1933 to 2007, for the last 25 years of his life, ran his own dance studio in Seoul, and was for a number of years in charge of a nightly music and dance show for tourists at a place called Korea House, so far more than a shaman. But he did have a very strong shaman history, which tracked back at least 9 generations, from his mother to his grandmother, all the way through. His son, Park Hwan-yong, works as an instrumentalist these days at a place called the National Kugak Center. And he, along with another musician, Che Ge-man, who I don't have here, you can see the first name there, Che Ge-man, and then Park Byung-chon, they both became holders of Chindo Shikimkut as important intangible cultural property number 72, the preservation form of a ritual. And preservation is very important in Korean shamanism today. In fact, if we go back even further to Park Chung-gi, who is the grandfather's brother of Park Byung-chon, 1870 to 1939, he was a particularly celebrated musician who's still remembered in Korea for developing a thing called Taegum Sanjo, a secular piece that's very well recorded, as well as the new folk song, Chindo Arirang. And Park Byung-chon once told me how his ancestor died. Park Chung-gi died in Wando, an island to the east of Chindo. As he played the flute, blood started dripping from the end. My grandfather's brother continued to play, and blood continued to flow from the instrument. He died with his lips still attached to it. Many other secular musicians also trace their lineage back to shamans. Anne Bi-chi, a very famed folk song singer from the central Gyeonggi region, would be one. Another would be my own drum teacher, named here as Kim Duk-soo, my drum teacher for Pansori. There are clear links in many places between shamans and music associations or musicians. The shaman associations were typically called shinchong. And these survived through until the 1960s in some places, but not beyond there. We still have the records, though, even though the shamans don't meet together. It was a sort of association or a fraternity. Fraternity is wrong, given that many of them were women, but never mind. A lot of famed musicians would go to the shinchong to teach the shamans music. And I've just got two examples of this sacred secular interface for pansori. Im Pangul and Park Huseng, both very well known to Koreans for pansori, and both spent a long time in Chindo teaching the shamans their style of performance. I've also mentioned something called Tangol Pan there. Let's not worry too much about that, but the shamans in the south were essentially given the rights to perform rituals in a geographical area, a number of villages, and they'd have a book with the names of everybody who they could perform rituals for. Because of that, they were called tangol. It's rather like you working with a shop, and you go in and you buy your food for the day or milk, and you don't need to pay until the end of the month. So it's that sort of very close relationship. Now, those shaman associations, the shinchong, as widespread as they were, relate very closely to the music associations we know about, called cheonchong. And those associations typically are the 17th and 18th century rather than more recently, but again we have records, and the records and the rules overlap very strongly. Coming back to this painting by Shin Yun Bok, 200 years ago, it shows musicians playing double-headed drum and oboe. And today, the instrumental lineup varies in different regions, sometimes including the flute and additional zithers. Variety, I suspect, is caused as much by availability as by design. Certainly, the oboe is always a core instrument. It has roots in Central Asia and appears to have been brought to Korea from China, where it's known as the bili. The equivalent Japanese instrument used particularly in gagaku court ensembles is a hichiriki. The oboe is the melodic instrument that Koreans consider is very close to the human voice, since it, virtually uniquely, is capable of the same wide and sudden fluctuations in dynamic, rapid and large melodic leaps, gentle ascending and descending portamento. And such techniques heighten emotion and are considered to add piquancy to any music. And since the oboe can closely imitate the voice, it's considered the instrument which spirits respond to. With this in mind, I'm going to play you a short excerpt from a contemporary piece written in 1971 by the Korean-German composer Lee Sang-yoon, who settled in Berlin, died in 1995. If some of you are old enough, you might know that in the late 60s, a number of Koreans resident in Germany were kidnapped by the South Korean regime, the KCIA, taken back to Seoul and put on trial for being against the military government of South Korea at the time. Lee Sang-yoon was one of those, and there was a campaign by Klemperer, Karajan, Stockhausen, many famous musicians to get him released from prison. His piece, Piri, the oboe is called the Piri, just is the soul of the person in prison crying out for deliverance. It's a very contemporary piece, of course. And here, rather than the Korean oboe, it's a Western oboe. The performer there was Heinz Heiliger. Now, the Korean oboe is characterized by a very large, oversized double reed, which is usually fashioned from the same bamboo as the tube, Those of you who have keen eyes will notice this is a plastic tube here. The size of the reed allows a player to adjust embouchure and facilitates considerable dynamic inflection. And this offers advantage. The player can adjust to the pitch of the shaman's song, for as a ritual progresses and tiredness sets in, she may gradually lower her register. At the same time, it's possible to finger the instrument with just one hand, utilizing air pressure and embouchure the mouth to change harmonics and thereby multiply the pitches available from any given fingering. And this frees the second hand so that the player can simultaneously beat a gong or drum. Here he has a zither in front of him, but he's actually beating a gong to the side. Why would he do this? Well, essentially, rituals were in the countryside for poverty-stricken local farmers who struggled to afford ritualists. There's going to be a contrast there with the videos you've seen of large-scale rituals, particularly in Seoul, where wealthy urbanites can afford more, but in the countryside, musicians cost money. Here's Kang Han-soo, 1928 to 1987, using the one-hand oboe technique. Till his death, Kang was probably the most accomplished Chindo oboist. One report notes that he exhibited a really excellent playing style, and he was the main informant for an article on mode in instrumental music by the folklorist Lee Bo-hyung. To maximize the advantages of the one-hand technique, Kang made his own instruments, normally from bamboo, but by the early 1980s, and in this picture, sometimes substituting plastic tubing for bodies. Because other Chindo players, oboe players, looked to him for guidance, his one-hand technique was widely copied, but it was never recorded in texts because it wasn't an authoritative version of playing the oboe. The oboe, said the scholars, should be played with two hands. And in fact, despite his undoubted skill, he was never close to rituals on stages. He disliked the idea of preservation of shamanism. And he pointed out that the musicians who took part in stage rituals were more performers than ritualists. His knowledge went back many generations. But he once told me, if you ask those performers who perform on stage what is black, they tell you what is white. Another instrument that's very common to shaman rituals around the center, so Seoul, north and south, but rarely encountered today is the fiddle, the heiliger. This is not a shaman musician, incidentally. The most revered and accomplished Seoul-based fiddle player died in the mid-1980s, effectively removing the instrument from instrumental lineups, while a second, Chi Yong-hee, who was equally at home teaching secular music, emigrated to Hawaii in 1975. In Chindo in the southwest, the last player died at least 50 years ago. The two-string fiddle that we have here, it arrived in Korea sometime before the 12th century from the northwestern Xinjiang region of China. And this might tempt one to suggest a connection with Central Asian shamanism, but there's no evidence. Indeed, in Korea, the fiddle is first mentioned in a secular poem, and then it features in court ensembles. This is a court musician. And in court music today, it's used to bind string and wind groups together. And in fact, that's the clue to why it's important in shaman rituals, because it isn't a typical zither. Zithers tend to pluck their notes, and the notes fade very, very quickly, the pitches. But the oboe can sustain those notes and can change the pitch, again, rather like the voice. So, rather like the oboe, the piri, it's an instrument that the spirits are said to find very appealing. Nonetheless, a ritual ensemble can never comprise just melodic instruments. For most arguments that music can generate altered states of consciousness around the world rely less on melody than on rhythm. Hence, percussion instruments are essential. From the Korean perspective, there are two distinct considerations here. The first is jumping up and down, the pulse of the rhythm changing as possession is perceived to occur, characterizes much shaman activity, particularly in the central and northern provinces. Hence, dancing like a metronome characterized Hia Park's initiation ritual, here she is as a shaman, for the northern Hwanghae province ritual style. Hia Park is today probably better known as a dancer, both in America and here in Germany. But she started as a musician in Seoul, and after emigrating to the States, went back to train as a shaman. Around Seoul, wanting to tap and dance to music, being exposed to music and dance as a child or an adolescent, is reported to make one vulnerable to the spirits. And if the favored melodic instruments imitate the shaman voice, percussion accompanies the shaman. The accompaniment marks time, it punctuates phrases, much as you would see in Buddhist temples or in court rituals. On a broader canvas, Carl Seashore, in his influential Psychology of Music, notes that rhythm gives rise to balance on some occasions and power on others. I quote, "Rhythm, whether in perception or action, is emotional when highly developed, and it results in the response of the whole organism to its pulsations. Such organic pulsations and secretions are the physical counterpart of emotion. Thus, when we listen to the dashing billows or the trickling raindrops, when we see the swaying of the trees in the wind or the waving of the wheat fields, we respond to these, we feel ourselves into them, and there is rhythm everywhere." Not surprisingly, the drum is often noted as a powerful symbol within shamanism. One journal even reflects this in its title, Shaman's Drum. Throughout Central Asia and Siberia, as well as in America and Northern Europe, frame drums are common, symbolizing boats, horses, or the entrance to the spirit world. And a frame drum is simply a single skin, open at the back, and you hold at the back. But the typical Korean drum looks like this. And there's one over here as well that your instruments museum collector has provided for me. The problem with this drum is it's closed. With a frame drum, if you sing into it, your pleads can get to the spirit world. If the spirits want to give messages back to you, they can do so. But with this instrument, you can't. The skins basically seal the body. The jango itself, though, is a complex instrument. It's typically bought and it's made from a single piece of paulownia wood, a type of balsa wood, turned on a lathe to give a thin, hollow waist. The two bowls are surmounted by skins held taut and laced between them with thongs so that you can raise the pitch of either drumhead. If you think in terms of Taoism, and some of you will be aware of Chinese Taoism, Taoism involves the heaven, the earth, and man. And in a way, the instrumentalist will sit in the middle of this drum, playing both ends. Earth, heaven as the higher pitch, and the body, the human world, in the middle. When you saw the video right at the beginning, it had a Chinese character. And the Chinese character, if I just draw it, was heaven, earth, with a line, and then the Chinese character for man between heaven and earth. So actually, this drum is very, very important philosophically and can link us into Taoism and so Chinese East Asian philosophy. But because it's manufactured, it's also expensive. And out in the countryside, other instruments have had to substitute in the past. A gourd or pottery water vessel, the hobok, on Jeju Island in the extreme south. An upturned bowl in water, the mulpagaji or mulchangu, from which another term, toshin, just from striking it, toshin, 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 like that, indicates the use for prayer, toshin. Wicker baskets, korichak, have also been used, perhaps, and particularly, we think, during times of shaman suppression during the colonial period. Throughout Korea's south, rather than the drum, the gong, the large gong, functions as the instrument through which the spirits speak and through which the shaman can speak to the spirit world. And I went to one ritual in 1984 where the shaman, Iwan Sun again, stopped the ritual half an hour in and said, "The spirit of the gong is angry." And she held a small ritual for the gong before she could go on with the ritual proper. So, from there, we have the characteristic type of local ritual on a big scale. Here we are back in Chindo with the shaman Kim Tae-rae, her musicians to one side. Very, very interesting. This too, though, is not really a local ritual. It's been updated. Again, in the southwest, in Chindo, rice bowl lids can be used. And in one particular scene, we're not talking about Taoism, we're now talking about a Buddhist connection. So shamanism bridges a number of different religious practices. Here, the shaman is invoking the spirit known to Koreans as Chesok, who is a spirit who came to earth and is reputed to have fathered triplets. Sakradevanam Indra is the Buddhist deity. So here she's dressed as a Buddhist monk. You can hardly see it, but she's got a sash, a red sash. You can see it better in that picture. The sash of a monk. A cornet, a type of hat associated with Buddhists. And now she's using the rice bowl lids as if they're symbols. And symbols are used in many parts of the world to invoke the spirit world. They're typical of Buddhism, but you can also find them amongst shaman paraphernalia in, say, Tibet, Nepal, South Asia, that far west. So in Chesok Kori, the scene is all to do with getting the spirit who fathered triplets to come and take the soul of the dead to the other world. If the instrumental lineup varies with shamanism in Korea, so do the type of Korean shamans or ritual practitioners. They fall into four basic types. Two are ecstatic, experiencing the descent of gods and fitting the classic definitions of shamanism by Mircea Eliade and others. And they are Mudang in the center and north, and Myeongdo further south. Two other types, though, know no ecstasy. The widespread hereditary Tangol of Korea's southern provinces, and down on the island of Jeju, Shimbang. Now, Koreans, including practitioners and scholars, subsume all indigenous religion under a single umbrella of shamanism. So, for anybody here who follows the tradition of Mircea Eliade and definitions of shamanism, who would call the third and the fourth, the Tangol and the Shimbang, more priests than shamans, hard luck, really. Koreans wouldn't agree with you. And in my discussion here, I can't see any reason to exclude the Tangol and the Shimbang. Now, that's fortunate, because if they don't go into trance, if there's no possessions in the spirit world, they have to show efficacy with the spirit world through their performance. And that means that the music and the dance is going to be more complex, more interesting to study, more interesting to record on video. There is, in Korea today, coming out of this, a good number of rituals that have been preserved. Here's one of the first that had government support from Yangju. So Norumkut, it's an agricultural ritual, originally from North Korea, but the east of North Korea, or southeast. Here, we're down on the island of Jeju in the south, with Chilmori Tangkut, a particular place that houses spirits. And the shaman here is the late An Sa-in. From the northwest, fishing rituals. Hwanghae Pe Yonshinkut here, and this is Kim Kumhwa, the shaman we saw in the first video. I'm going to skip that and go to there. Until very recently, there are actually more shamans than there were doctors in Korea. Shamans restored peace in the spirit world. They led the dead to the other world. They healed the sick. They ensured peace, safety, and wealth amongst the living. The main shaman association in the early 1990s, it was known at that time as the Association for Victory Over Communism and Respect for Beliefs. Very curious title. It claimed a membership of just over 40,000, 42,000 shamans in the whole peninsula. But that number is declining, or more accurately, it's changing, as old practices die out. but changing because more fortune tellers operate these days than people who will give you a whole ritual. For shaman rituals then to survive, the government has decided to preserve rituals as intangible cultural properties, a term borrowed from Japan, muyongmun화재 or 중요 무형문화재 in Korea. The main ones of these, including shaman rituals, are called important intangible cultural properties. Underneath them, there are regional, provincial cultural properties. These can be performed on concert stages and used as the basis of fusions in contemporary compositions. Now, shamans, until recently, were the lowest of the low. They were outcast. They were not allowed to own land. They very rarely could read or write. But these days, if a shaman is appointed to an intangible cultural property, then they're called a holder, a guardian. Poyuja is the Korean term that's usually used. You can see Japan has a slightly different term. Or a living human treasure, a wonderful term taken from the French, actually. Today, we can see that the government in South Korea has appointed shaman rituals representing the geographical spread of the peninsula. Up in today's North Korea, the top right-hand element, Pyeolshinkut, and the Sonorikut. So Pyeolshinkut was Kim Kumoi, the first video. Sonorikut was the picture I showed you just now. On the east coast, around Gangneung Tanuje, a spring festival involving shamanism. Down on the southeast coast, on the east of the southeast coast, 82-1 is Tonghaean Pyeolshinkut, 82-4 is Namhaean, the south coast, southeast coast, Pyeolshinkut. Jeju Island, Jeju Chilmorikut. The numbers are the numbers of the intangible cultural properties, so number 71. The southwest, South Chola, there we have it, number 72, Shikimkut, that I've talked quite a bit about. Going to North Chola, another Pyeolshinkut in the area around Wido. In Gyeonggi and Seoul, two more rituals, 98 and 104. Why preserve? Well, Koreans are actually not alone in this. With a broad sweep of his brush, the American folklorist Ben Feintuch once noted how contemporary societies spark their people to remember the wealth of local life, to think about matters close at hand and close at heart. Similarly, the Czech novelist Milan Kundera wistfully lamented that the struggle of power is a struggle of memory over forgetting. There is a basic problem in our contemporary zeitgeist, our contemporary life, in which we have a standardized international culture, MTV, CNN, and many people seem perfectly happy with that. Scholars, journalists, politicians, and others call for diversity, though, for the maintenance of traditional music, traditional crafts, traditional arts. The late Alan Lomax, an ethnomusicologist who I follow, once wrote that the earth is an agreeable habitat because of its diversity. Now, if we want that diversity, then we need to preserve traditional culture. But if we move our gaze from culture to shamanism, we enter contested territory. Religion, of course, is a contested entity in itself, and where a religion such as shamanism verges on superstition, or ideas that are broadly thought of as pre-modern, backward, or they lack comprehensive literature, Buddhism has texts, Christianity has texts, shamanism doesn't. Then there are going to be problems. Preserving shamanism is a more extreme move than, say, the Catholic Archbishop Lefebvre continuing to hold Mass in Latin in the 1970s, or Lutherans here in Germans or Anglicans in Britain trying to keep to a pure traditional form of belief. Not surprisingly then, as Korean shaman rituals begin to find new interpretive forms to satisfy the preservation agenda, the problems are often sidestepped. Many scholars, and hence much of the writing you can find in English, assume that there's an archetype, a tradition, that can be found and studied, and they avoid mention of rituals performed on stages. Korean scholars encouraged shamans to restore ritual to maintain its spiritual essence, and the preservation system has often required the inclusion or the reincorporation of specific texts and elements that shamans no longer knew, and they've done that before the shaman ritual can be preserved. Here, Kim Tae-rae, a shaman who you've seen in a couple of photographs already, and I'll point her out in a minute again, told me in 1983, we used a book that I assumed had been compiled by Buddhists. She couldn't read and write, incidentally. It contained all the words for ritual. She had to learn them. 10 years ago, we knew much fewer Buddhist texts, but we were encouraged to use them by scholars. Many sections of Shikun-kut, they said, had been forgotten or had fallen into disuse. One particular folklorist said that if we'd worked out the original form, we might be able to achieve recognition as an intangible cultural property. So the Nami Amitabha, excuse me, is a Buddhist text, and it was in one of the videos earlier. Now, actually, during my first fieldwork in the early 1980s, the previous 2 decades were identified as the time when a ritual such as Shikun-kut had declined. Reasons offered included the growth of Christianity and state oppression and the prohibitive cost of mounting large rituals. But local rituals, the top left, were often given by small forces, nominally a shaman and 2 accompanists. And this shaman here is Kim Tae-rae in both pictures. Staged ritual concerts required larger forces, 2 or 3 shamans, 5 or more musicians, and in the 1980s a single dancer, or by the 1990s in the video you saw of the Southwest, a group of dancers. Performers could specialize because they had no need to give a complete ritual. And urban audiences couldn't be expected to sit through all-night rituals, so scenes were abbreviated, leaving a standard concert-length performance. Presentation assumed great importance. Musicians, in the bottom picture here, bottom right, wore a resurrected costume vestigial of the 19th century. Shamans, in both pictures, wore traditional dress, hanbok, in white, as befits death, rather than the multicolored variety seen at festival times. By the early 1980s, a dancer was added. The symbolism enshrined in paraphernalia, paper money, paper spirits, paper ancestral tablets, spirit poles, and so on, was blurred. For a 1985 tour by this group in the bottom right, paper spirits became large reusable props that could be better seen from the back row of the theatre. Where in local rituals the danger of spirits attaching themselves to the props meant that the props would be burnt at the end of a ritual, on tour or in Seoul, the props are kept. On stage, plastic fruit can replace the 3 colors of fruit required on local altars. There is an altar behind her at the bottom right picture. The spirits, if called, would have been insulted on stage, and so the shaman tries not to call the spirits. And the changes that have occurred in preserving things have left many scholars very concerned. The feeling is that ritualists become professional performers, but by doing so, they perform a static, museumized form of the ritual. Nowadays, Mi-kyung Park says, many shamans are unable to realize the real thing. If there is a degenerative aspect, then this is it. Or again, it isn't like the old days anymore. Why? Well, there's no gusto or zest. Certainly, putting shamanism on stage to create a ritual concert, a konyon, rather than a ritual, a kut, has left scholars with many concerns. Sun Son-hwa writes that shaman folklore is a combination of religiosity and entertainment, whose ritualists have been both priests and clowns. She says that many shamans feel they have reason to exist only when their shamanic practice remains as a living religion for a sufficient number of believers. And Sun was actually referring to Kim Kumoi, the 84-year-old person who was on the first video, from Hwanghae province in today's North Korea, now working between Seoul and the port city of Incheon. She's been a star since the 1960s. And if we turn to her, she says rather differently. that when she was appointed as a holder of an intangible cultural property, well, here we have it. I'll never forget how I felt that day in February 1985 when my ritual was designated as an intangible cultural property and I was named a holder. I'd always been frustrated by the neglect of shamanistic art forms. So the property, 82.2, that she's designated for, has two components. The first is called Peiyonshinkut, and it was once given at the request of boat owners and mixed ritual with entertainment as it invoked local tutelary spirits and the military spirits of local mountains, as well as the dragon king of the sea. It was not strictly communal, unlike the second component, known as Tedonkut. This was given throughout a settlement in house courtyards, meeting places on the banks of the river and on show. Basically, the two things. The first one is for fishermen, as they set out to sea, to be protected from storms and the spirits of those storms. The second one is for local villages, to protect the local village from, say, goblins and nasty things that get into your water or your rice and cause it to give you illness. She seemed perfectly happy with what had happened there, and she's recently been filmed. A film has been made, a documentary film about her life, in which she reflects on these staged performances. Still, though, other scholars writing about her still say there is a problem here. The next quote here is from Li Yongshik, a musicologist. I don't think it's a shaman ritual. He's actually quoting Kumoi, the same person. I don't think it's a shaman ritual. There's nobody who wishes his or her prayer, only foreign spectators, photographers and researchers. It's just an artistic performance for those spectators. Or put in a different way, the final comment there from Che Jong-mu, staged rituals are a ritual of modernization to exorcise the evil of magic. My contention about staged rituals is slightly different from most Korean scholars. It seems that the shamans nominated within the state preservation system have the Korean public's trust as guardians of something called authentic ritual. As icons of identity, though, their ritual concerts must look good if they're going to provide a positive view of the Korean cultural landscape and to embrace the contemporary image of shamanism as an integral part of Korean identity. Hence, they must adjust local ritual practice. If you are watching a film of a Korean shaman ritual, you'd want to watch the film of the bottom right rather than the top left. But the bottom right is already preserved and to some extent staged. It seems to be the scholars who are concerned here rather than the ritualists. And actually the last 20 years has seen shamans become commercial musicians on a series of recordings. Coming out of the staged ritual concerts, shamans were invited to work with other musicians. The shamans from Chindo, who I've talked about, Pak Pyong-chon at the top, Kim Tae-dae in the middle, and at the bottom it's Kim Tae-dae, but you can't see her. Here are 3 of their albums, where they use improvisation from shaman rituals to create a new style of contemporary music. Here is another shaman group from the southeast, Tonghaean Pyolshinkut, number 82-1, led by the legendary musician Kim Sok-chul. Unfortunately, he died, 5 or 6 years ago. He was the husband of a shaman, but a very key musician, and his family intermarried down the whole of the East Coast to control ritual practice. In the 1980s, he discovered that the percussion that he was using and his people were using in rituals could go on stages. And so we have 3 recordings here of his. The first one, top right, is just mu-ak, so shaman music, supposedly the percussion from the ritual. The second, he starts playing different instruments and working with other musicians, including a Mongolian and a Japanese, to create a song of the high wind, and then West End moving more international in the bottom there. He's even discussed in the literature as something other than a ritualist. There's a quote from the second album there, actually, from the recording engineer, a Japanese, Toyoki Okijima. He is the musician, the shaman, a keeper of Korean traditional music and ethnic music, a pioneer of a new dimension of traditional music, a person expressing the real soul of Korean people, and a musician who has an open mind to different cultures and a spirit to love the challenge of new things. So shamanism that was local rituals for farming communities, for isolated communities, is now a commercial project. But beyond this, it's become the source, the foundation of very new creation. And at this point, I'm going to move to a completely different thing, but it's connected. This is an Australian jazz percussionist. His name is Simon Barker. Now, there's a lot of jazz in East Asia. There's a lot of jazz in Australia. The problem is, it's playing music which is basically New York, East Coast America from the 1930s. A lot of Australians want to find a new jazz language. And Simon Barker went to Korea and discovered this last southeastern shaman, took his music apart and reconstructed it to create a new grammar, a new jazz language, which is now being taught throughout Korea, Japan, and of course Australia. And this is just the trailer to a feature film made by a person called Emma France, featuring Simon Barker. He was one of my PhD students. So how shaman music becomes something very different. And the film title, Intangible Asset or Intangible Cultural Property, number 82, Kim Sok-chul. To conclude, this is roughly where we're at with Korean shamanism. Local rituals are declining fast, but they're being replaced by staged theatrical presentations considered to contain the core components, the nuggets of religious practice, if you like, both prescribed as authentic forms and yet designed to look good to an admiring audience. The music remains most complex in the South, where the vestiges of hereditary shamanism remain, and yet those shamans pose a problem for those who subscribe to the definitions of shamanism by Mircea Eliade and so on. So let me end with a quote from a nationalist literature scholar, Kim Yeol-gyu. Shamanism is gradually disappearing from Korea, but our shaman consciousness is not easily lost. The consciousness may remain with Koreans forever, because it once gave meaning to our lives. And that neatly encapsulates why shamanism is and remains important to Koreans. And music, the rhythms of souls and of soul, is a key element of rituals, both local and urban, both staged and village, both international and national, both new creativity and something specifically shamanic. It is the music that is perhaps the most appreciable part of shamanism in our contemporary world. Thank you very much.